Charlie Wilson's War movie review. So you remember this movie, right? This was really topical 10 years ago. This is another one of my old movie reviews, which I go through and reread one of the reviews I wrote years ago on the blog for whatever that may be worth, or may not be worth. In this case, this movie was recommended to me by one of my students at the time. I was teaching English in Japan. One of my Japanese students had rented it, had bought the DVD. It was released in Japan, of course, with Japanese subtitles, and she absolutely loved it, and she said, "You've got to watch this movie." And I said, yeah, but I had no intention of watching it. I was trying to take a break from watching so many movies at the time. But then she actually showed up to class the next week with the DVD and gave it to me and said, "You really should watch this." So out of obligation more than anything else, I took the DVD home and watched it, and I absolutely loved it. So I know this movie was popular 10 years ago and that you've probably already seen it a long time ago, but on the off chance, if you haven't seen this movie yet, highly recommended it. Highly recommend. It's a really great movie. It is incredibly well written. Now, at the time I saw this movie, I didn't really know who Aaron Sorkin was. Aaron Sorkin is a screenwriter. I guess he first rose to big fame, well, with A Few Good Men long ago. But I think his big break was The West Wing, which he got really famous for. I was never a big West Wing fan. I watched a few episodes. I enjoyed them well enough. I never got hugely into the show. So the name Aaron Sorkin didn't mean anything to me at the time. When I really remember first starting to hear that name a lot was, I guess, when The Newsroom came out, which was one of his less successful TV shows, and also The Social Network, which was another one of his. He was a screenwriter for that one. So later, once I learned what the name was, I kind of put two and two together and realized that this was the guy who had also done Charlie Wilson's War. At the time I first saw this movie, I had no idea who he was, didn't know who the screenwriter was, but was just really impressed with the writing here. The dialogue is pointed, it's snappy, it's funny. The characters are trading well-crafted barbs back and forth with each other. It's very good entertainment. The exposition in this movie was really well done. There's a lot of dialogue which is doubling as exposition, but it never gets boring or anything. In fact, this is screenwriting at its finest, really. You know, if I was a college professor teaching a course on screenwriting, I think I would use this movie as required viewing. There's a lot of complex war politics going on in this movie. For example, why they have to use Egypt and Israel to supply the Afghan fighters covertly with Soviet-made weapons, the difficulties of getting the Egyptians and the Israelis to work together during this period. It's complex, but it's all laid out very clearly and succinctly for the audience. But the screenwriter doesn't beat you over the head with it either. The information is put out there once and only once. And if you're not paying attention, well, then you just you miss out on it. So the effect of this is to make you feel like you're able to keep track of what's happening, but somebody not quite as smart as you, who isn't paying quite as much close attention, isn't going to catch everything. It's one of these rare Hollywood movies where instead of like feeling dumber after you've watched it, you actually feel smarter, like your intelligence is being rewarded in this movie instead of punished. In addition to that, Aaron Sorkin makes a great job of having a lot of these scenes double perform. So, for example, there's two plots going on. There's Charlie Wilson's funding for the war in Afghanistan. And then there's Charlie Wilson's being investigated for ethics. And a lot of these scenes are actually carrying both of the plot at once. And it's just classic screenwriting, the way Aaron Sorkin is able to pull this off. It's the writing in this movie is really very clever. And the acting is excellent. Philip Seymour Hoffman, I've been a fan of his for a long time. Even when he was just getting kind of minor parts in movies, I started to notice him, and I've always thought he was an excellent actor. And then when he started to come into his own and started getting a lot more major parts, I was really happy to see, and I thought he did an excellent job in this as the cynical CIA agent. I think this was one of his best roles, actually. Tom Hanks, I'm not a huge Tom Hanks fan. I know Tom Hanks is like the most popular actor ever, but there are some movies in which I find him kind of annoying, to be honest. But I think Tom Hanks is one of those actors where if he's with the right director, he can be very good. And in this movie, he is excellent. He just plays this hard-drinking, fast-talking congressman just perfectly. It's incredible. So, as far as entertainment value, I would highly recommend this movie. Now, the politics of this movie. The politics of this movie are maybe a bit more problematic. And I'm going to make a huge disclaimer right at the beginning of this section saying, I'm not an expert, you know, so take my opinion with a grain of salt is what I'm saying. Let me know if in the comments if I'm getting anything wrong, but that disclaimer aside, I'm going to get into it and talk about where maybe I agree with the politics and where I disagree with the politics of this movie. Aaron Sorkin, the writer, I think, has a reputation for being one of those big Hollywood liberals. And at the time this movie came out, this along with Lions for Lambs, which came out around the same time, were kind of lumped together in the same category of like liberal Hollywood critiques of the war. But I didn't really find it all that liberal, to be honest. So the movie takes the idea that the U.S. has the best of intentions in Afghanistan. We just kind of bumble it, or we don't follow it through, to be honest, or follow it through all the time. But yeah, there are some indications that the U.S. war in Afghanistan, or the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan in the 1980s, was not always entirely altruistic. There's one thing, and maybe this is a little bit out of the scope of this movie, but Carter's national security advisor, guy with a Polish name who I'm going to mispronounce here, Zbigniew Brzezinski, at one time, years after this whole thing, gave an interview to a French magazine in the 1990s in which he claimed that the U.S. tricked the Soviets into invading Afghanistan, by which he meant that the U.S. created the circumstances in the Afghanistan which would make it, which enticed, well, no, that's not the right word, it created the circumstances which made it more likely for the Soviets to invade. This was widely reported in Europe in the 1990s. It didn't get reported in the US a lot, but it's one of Noam Chomsky's favorite examples, which is where I've picked it up from. But I've actually gone through the trouble to Google search this myself, and found the French magazine. You can find the quote online yourself, in which he gives this quote. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time talking. Now, Chomsky, when Chomsky talks about this, Chomsky says you always have to take this with a grain of salt, because other than Brzezinski's interview, there's no other evidence for this. So it's entirely possible Brzezinski was just bragging and taking credit for something that he couldn't take credit for, or that he wasn't actually involved with. But if it was true, then that's pretty heavy. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt. But if it was true, then that's That's a lot of people dying in Afghanistan in the 1980s just for this political game that Brzezinski was playing. Now, I guess getting back to the movie has some criticisms of U.S. foreign policy. The biggest one is it criticizes the U.S. failure to stay involved with Afghanistan. This comes in heavily at the end of the movie, where the U.S. is thinking, all right, job well done, we got the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And there are reports coming in that Afghanistan is beginning to fall apart, and Charlie Wilson is trying to get funding to stay involved in Afghanistan, and nobody's paying attention. And I think that's all true as far as it goes. The thing that I was bothered with by this movie is that the movie itself just never seems to question the wisdom of supplying these Islamic radicals with all this state-of-the-art weaponry in the first place. Now, the CIA to this day cannot account for all the Stinger missiles that it supplied Islamic fundamentalists with during the 1980s. These Stinger missiles are capable of shooting down passenger airplanes from the ground, and there's some reports that that's what these Islamic fundamentalists have been trying to do with these weapons since the war with the Soviets ended. Although, to be fair to this movie, perhaps the writers of the movie, I guess the writer, Aaron Sorkin, felt that recent events could speak for themselves, and maybe he felt that he didn't need to connect the dots so explicitly. Still, I think it was a point that maybe the movie could have made clearer. Another thing, it's never really talked about in this movie why the Soviets got involved in Afghanistan in the first place. It's just implied that the Soviets did it because they were evil. They invade Afghanistan just because they were an evil empire, and that's what evil empires do. But it wasn't like they just rolled out of bed one morning and decided to invade Afghanistan for the sake of being evil. They had an allied government in Afghanistan, which was under a threat because of insurgency within its country. So they invaded to support the government in Afghanistan requested that the Soviets come in and assist them. Now, this doesn't really excuse anything. The Soviets shouldn't have invaded Afghanistan. It was an insurgency by the Afghan people, so the Soviets should have stayed out of it. But this was also the exact same reason that the U.S. got involved in Vietnam. So, when we go and support a client government against its own people, it's because we are misguided idealists. When the Soviets do it, it's because they're warmongering communists. Now, this double standard is in this movie. For example, at one point, Congressman Doc Long made a speech to the Afghans in which he said that his son was wounded fighting in Vietnam. So he knows all about fighting the Soviet oppressors. So notice that in both wars, apparently the Soviets are the oppressors. When the U.S. invades South Vietnam to help a client government, the Soviets are the oppressors. When the Soviets invade Afghanistan to help a client government, the Soviets are the oppressors. The Soviets are always the aggressors. And I guess you could make the argument that this is Doc Long, this is not the screenwriters of the film, but this is, at the same time, this was a view that was not contradicted anywhere else in the film. Now, at the tail end of the film does do a good job of depicting what is common knowledge now, that because of the U.S. neglect of Afghanistan after the Soviets withdrew, it allowed for the country to disintegrate and become a breeding ground for terrorists and resentment against the West. And this is really maybe the main point of this movie, because it is scary to contemplate the extent to which this is probably happening all over again. It's a little bit hard to figure out what actually is going on in Afghanistan these days. When this movie came out 10 years ago, Afghanistan was still on the front pages of the newspapers. Well, kind of. It was still in the newspapers, generally at least, or people were still talking about it at least. I haven't seen anything about Afghanistan in the news for, I don't know, a few years now, it feels like. Now, I'm sure if I was better informed, I'm sure the information is publicly out there, but I don't know. Do you know what's going on in Afghanistan nowadays? I mean, unless you're exceptionally well informed or actively seeking this stuff out, it's, I check the BBC webpage daily. I check CNN's webpage daily. I watch I do pay attention to the news to a certain extent, to a large extent, to a normal extent. I don't know what's going on in Afghanistan, but certainly the last I heard about it, it sounded like the U.S. was pulling out and things were falling apart. And yeah, so the message of this movie, that it's not enough to just bomb a country and then leave, or to flood weapons into a country and then leave, that it's good to stay actively involved and fund. Well, I don't know. What can you do with Afghanistan, huh? It's a complicated question, I guess. So I'll just leave the review here.